Got it. Okay, thanks, Kate.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Rumble on the River, the community forum. What's up with Zenith Energy and the critical energy infrastructure hub in Portland? My name is Kate Murphy. I'm a community organizer with Columbia Riverkeeper based out of our Portland office, and I have the pleasure of moderating the discussion this evening. We have a fantastic panel lined up. I'm really excited about this conversation that's going to be happening. We're going to be covering a lot of material, including the history of the area, an overview of the CEI hub, the risks to public health and safety, the latest updates about what's happening at Zenith, and how you all can get engaged. So we have a lot of different things to discuss. We are proud to be putting together this community forum series in partnership with over 20 co-sponsors who are supporting the series. So that's also really exciting. We would like to begin tonight's community forum with a land acknowledgement. We recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge that the places we are joining today's community forum from rest on the traditional lands of Native people who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. I am joining from Portland, Oregon, which rests on the traditional lands of multiple tribal nations and bands, including Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes here. To learn more about Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties, we encourage you to visit the websites for those tribal nations. And you can also check out native-land.ca to look for more information about the land where you live. I will be putting some links in the chat throughout the evening. So we'll be putting additional resources and information and things like that. So keep an eye out for that. With that, we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide. There we go. So tonight's community forum, as I mentioned, is sponsored by more than 20 co-sponsors. There you can see most of the logos up there. So for those who are interested, this is just a few housekeeping issues. For people who need it, there's closed captioning available during the webinar, and you can find that feature at the bottom of your screen. We are planning on having a question and answer session at the end. So be thinking about what your questions are and keep those in mind, because I'll be asking you to put your questions in the chat at the end of the conversation. We will also be wrapping up tonight's webinar with a little bit of music, so stick around for that at the end. And as some of you know, we are recording the webinar tonight, so everybody will be receiving an email in the next several days that'll have a link to the recording with some additional resources and things like that. So feel free to make sure and share those with your friends and family so we can spread the word. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. So if we could go to the next slide. So we're going to be hearing first from Micah Mescals. Micah is the activist program manager with Portland Audubon. For the last 10 years, Micah has been involved with countless environmental campaigns along the Willamette River as part of the conservation team at Portland Audubon, from helping turn out unprecedented public comments on the Willamette River Superfund cleanup, organizing initial opposition to the dangerous Pembina propane terminal, or the decades-long battle over land use policies on the river. Micah and Portland Audubon conservation team have long prioritized campaigns on the Willamette River, as it is the lifeblood of the area's natural ecosystem. And following Micah, we're going to hear from John Waszutinsky. John is the Multnomah County Office of Sustainability Director. The Office of Sustainability works with county staff and community members to promote programs and policies that lead to a more equitable, prosperous, and environmentally sound Multnomah County. Under John's leadership, the Office of Sustainability has updated the joint City of Portland and Multnomah County Climate Action Plan, launched a clean energy finance program called Property Fit Oregon, advocated for stronger air quality regulations, and work with the Board of County Commissioners to set the ambitious goal of transitioning the county to 100% renewable energy by 2050. Following John, we'll hear from Melanie. Melanie is a retired OBGYN who volunteers at the intersection of health and climate change for organizations such as 350 PDX and Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Melanie is a longtime community activist who's worked on several campaigns throughout the region to stop fossil fuels. Next, we'll hear from Nick Caleb. Nick serves as a climate and energy attorney at Breach Collective, providing legal and strategic support to grassroots partners around the country. He has significant experience in climate, energy, and air quality law and policy, having been deeply involved in efforts to prohibit fossil fuel infrastructure and in Portland and throughout the Pacific Northwest. Nick has a unique knowledge of municipal level strategies for restricting the activities of the fossil fuel industry. And following Nick, we'll hear from Lori King. Lori worked with Justice for over 20 years. She was one of the founding members of Climate Jobs PDX, a group that helps to form a bridge between the climate and labor movements. Climate Jobs also helped get PSEF passed and worked to get strong OSHA rules on excessive heat and wildfire smoke. So we've heard enough from me. I'm really excited to get this conversation started. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Micah to kick us off. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, for setting the stage and for moderating. As she mentioned, my name is Micah. I use he, him pronouns, work with Portland Audubon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Willamette River in this part of the city. So I'm starting with a map from 1841. It's from the Oregon Historical Society. It shows the tribal territories within Oregon. And you can focus in on the dark blue section where the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette Rivers is. And it's also the surrounding lowlands, first inhabited 11,000 years ago by the Chinookan-speaking peoples. This included the Clackamas, Cathlamet, Multnomah, and Tualatin tribes. Most of these tribes lived in small mobile groups who split their time between winter villages and seasonal camps to gather the abundant food that was in the area. And this included salmon, sturgeon, smelt, waterfowl, deer, elk, nuts, berries, roots, and bulbs. Many of these villages, both the winter and seasonal, were located around the confluence, which helped facilitate trade to the south along the Willamette and east and west along the Columbia. These communities lived in harmony with the natural world for thousands of years before trappers, missionaries, and settlers decimated their populations with diseases and displaced them for much of their land with genocidal violence. For a more extensive accounting of this history, the Oregon Historical Society is a really good resource. So I suggest checking that out. Next slide. This next slide is a survey map from 1852, and it really demonstrates the landscape that was present at that time. And you can tell it's very different than what it is today. Both the Willamette and the Columbia were free flowing with their main channels shifting from year to year. It was connected to floodplains, wetlands, braided side channels, swamps, and small streams. And most of that was vegetated as bottomland ash and cottonwood forests. You can see that Columbia Slough is braided from the confluence to Blue Lake. Smith and Bybee wetlands right at the confluence was a significant wetland complex. You can see Swan Island along the channel. It is an actual island, and you can see the channel actually, the river channel was actually on the east side historically. And then we also have Giles Lake, which was a large wetland complex of marshes and little streams, and that is now in what is Northwest Portland. So we'll be talking about that. And these connected waterways provide a plethora of habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife, both seasonally and year-round. And it's especially important as Portland is located on both the north-south and east-west migratory corridors. Next slide. So this next slide kind of shows some current conditions, or some current existing conditions which may have been reflective of what it looked like back then. So the first picture is of Multnomah Channel, which is just north of Portland, which It's representative of what the main stem might have looked like. You also have Tryon Creek, which is a cold water-bearing stream that connects the floodplain to the riparian habitat in the upland. Next slide. And this is on the left is a side channel at the Columbia Slough confluence with the Willamette. And then the second picture is Smith and Bybee wetlands, which demonstrates like the large significant wetland structures that, that the river connected with. Next slide. So now we're getting into the 1900s where we're seeing significant human alteration and mostly to facilitate commerce and industry. The first picture is of a dock at St. John's to facilitate trade. Today, that is now at Cathedral Park, which floods seasonally with some restored habitat. Second slide is building of docks and hardening of riverbank in downtown. And today it's been further hardened in the seawall with the seawall, and it still floods as we saw in the 96 flood. And then the last one is the filling of wetlands at Gouds Lake, which was initially used for farming and trash disposal, completely filled and is now part of the Northwest Industrial District. Next slide. So more conditions and alterations over time. The left picture is disconnecting of the main channel from previously connected wetlands of Smith and Bybee. You can see that on the very top of the picture, and North Portland just below that. Second picture is the shifting of the channel west with to the other side of Swan Island. And as we'll see later, the further hardening of Swan Island took place. And then the last one is the hardening of bank for infrastructure, the St. John's Bridge in this example, but it also allowed for industry to kind of pop up alongside that. Next slide. So world events helped shape further development and industrialization along the river. World War I and II drove the need for shipbuilding, which led to shipyards along the Willamette. The first picture is at Rivergate, which is north of St. John's and Cathedral Park. Swan Island in the second was connected to the shoreline, hardened and filled and built on top of. And the third picture is Gouds Lake, which initially hosted the World Fair in 1905, which led to the building of the first levee that disconnected Gouds Lake from the river, later completely filled and used for farmland. And then that was developed as housing for shipbuilders and other industry workers before they were then displaced for industry, which now exists today. And all three of these are major alterations impact us today. Separation of Smith and Bybee and other wetlands from the main channel greatly reduces flood capacity and disconnects important habitat. It also hardens the bank and removes riparian habitat. The hardening of the channel removes side channel habitat, which is especially important for salmon. And then the filling of Gouds Lake and other wetlands for industrial development really puts the broader community at risk today, which we'll hear about later because of the risk of liquefaction during earthquake. And lastly, these industries all left a long legacy of harmful pollution that greatly impacted the landscape and the communities that were adjacent to today. Next slide. The timber industry also had a major role in shaping the river. Mills and docks were common along the river. Log rafts choked the river, destroyed emergent vegetation. The processing of timber was especially problematic, especially at creosote sites where power poles were treated with noxious and persistent chemicals that continue to contaminate the shoreline today. Next slide. And over the decades, industry shifted, environmental conditions worsened, and new threats arose. Many docks, like the one shown on the left, became derelict and abandoned, oftentimes retaining pollutants and having other negative effects on the river. Petrochemical industry became established, and almost the entire riverbank from downtown to Portland to the confluence became hardened and reinforced, leaving little to no space for vegetation or flood mitigation. Next slide. The centuries of pollution remained and persisted on the uplands along the river and sediment, much of the river leading to the designation of an 11-mile stretch of federal Superfund site, which is reserved for the most contaminated sites in the country. The contamination presents a real risk to people, especially those who eat resident fish from the river, and it's a huge risk for fish and wildlife populations. After decades of advocacy, the EPA has now mandated 140 plus responsible parties to begin cleanup of the river. And that record of decision came in 2016, and cleanup has begun of that sediment, which is great, but it's going to take a long time. DEQ also led the upland portion of that cleanup, and many of those sites are still present today. Next slide. Some of the worst upland contamination has rendered many of the sites unusable. This picture on the far side of the bank, just below Forest Park, is Arkema, where Agent Orange was produced. That site will remain contaminated for at least 500 years, probably longer. And is just a really good example of how bad some of the pollution is. And if the centuries of contamination from industry and the significant physical alteration of the river wasn't enough, these same industrial interests have been able to secure reductions in environmental protections along the same stretch of river. And it's all been in the name of jobs and economic growth, to the detriment of community and the environment. Next slide. Riverbank protections for habitat on the stretch of the river are a fraction of what they are, limiting that throughout the rest of the city, which limits vegetation and habitat creation. It also limits public access to the river, which is quite limited throughout this whole stretch. Protections for trees is also non-existent in this space due to the industrial zoning code. And this includes both, oh, I need to wrap up. This includes along the water, but also the uplands. Next slide. Rubble and other industrial waste remain instead of the gentle sloped beaches, which would provide habitat and flood retention. Next slide. And ongoing industrial contamination continues. Next slide. This is a steel processing plant. And this is all while local communities and wildlife suffer. Next slide. So there are some bright spots that, as you'll hear about today. There's momentum around the CEI hub and Zenith and other fossil fuel centric industries. There's also ongoing cleanup of contaminated river sediment throughout Superfund, as I mentioned. And there's also restoration of important riverside habitat, both at Willamette Cove, which is at the top of this picture, just north of U of P and the railroad bridge. And that's a space that advocates were able to push metro or regional government to adequately clean up. And that will eventually be a park, a natural area for the community to access the river. And next slide. And there are lots of local, actually we can go to the next slide too, sorry. And there are lots of local upcoming land use policy decisions, which could greatly increase environmental protections along this stretch. And they will only happen with advocacy from you all and the broader community. They include the City of Portland's economic opportunities analysis, which sort of dictates the different rules around environmental zoned land, including the, industrial zone land, which includes the environmental protections. There's an update of the Portland Tree Code, which is coming, which advocates are pushing for the removal of the exemption that industrial lands currently retain in that code. There's also the cleanup of Willamette Cove and EPA's continued Superfund cleanup. So to stay engaged on those different issues, you can follow Portland Audubon and join our mailing list to hear updates. And I will pass it to John.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to jump in there. Thanks so much, Mike, for bringing the perspective of really like how short a time this has been an industrial sacrifice zone, right? We saw those pictures from really in the big scale of things not that long ago, where it was really a beautiful wetland and people lived there. And so it gives me hope when I think about re-envisioning what that area can look like. So thank you for framing that and showing us all those great pictures. And yes, now let's move to hearing from John, who's going to talk more about the CEI hub and some of the risks that we face. I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thank you so much. My name is John Waszczynski. I use he, him pronouns. I work for Multnomah County. and I'm the sustainability director at Multnomah County, reporting to Chair Deborah Kafori. Activists approached the county a couple of years ago and really asked us to further investigate the dangers that the CEI hub poses to the region, and what the costs were, because we thought about this idea of trying to make sure that the cost for any potential accident at the hub or issue related to a spill would be borne by the polluters themselves. And so we launched onto this study that I'm going to go over the results of. So next slide, please. No, this is maybe a little bit of a blurry slide, but it kind of goes to but we're looking again at the area that Micah was talking about in Northwest Portland. The areas highlighted in orange are the facilities that we now consider the CEI hub. Most of us are probably familiar with those tank farm facilities if we've ever driven up Highway 30 going towards the St. John Bridge and beyond towards the Sauvie Island Bridge. So this kind of gives you a good indication of what we're looking at, close to the confluence with the Columbia River. Next slide, please. And what is the CEI hub? It's a grouping of tanks, essentially. Those tanks are connected to pipelines that bring, or I should say, let me be specific here. Some of the tanks are connected to pipelines that come down from Washington. If you've ever been up to Anacortes and Cherry Point and those big refineries down there, and they supply over 90% of the liquid fuels that are burned here in the state of Oregon. Next slide, please. So we set out in the study to sort of to understand what a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake would do to this area. So what's the extent of the impacts, what kind of materials are stored there, how many would be released, how would they be released, how much damage would it cause, and what would be the cost of that damage, and who's responsible under current law. Next slide, please. I should note that this kind of analysis is kind of inherently uncertain. We know that a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake is going to happen. We don't know when exactly, and the time of year can impact the conditions. Luck, is there good luck or bad luck, I guess? How much fuel is being stored at the hub at any given moment varies. And how severe an earthquake is, all those things are going to have an impact on where along the fault line it occurs. So there's a lot of variability here. So we're kind of looking at the most likely grouping of scenarios to give us a sense of the scale of magnitude for an issue like this. Next slide, please. So what's the geological risk? It turns out it's pretty bad. If we're it's a little hard to tell on this slide, but those areas that are outlined are those CEI hub facilities that we saw before. The area on the sort of bottom of the slide is Forest Park, and as we go towards the river kind of bisects the image, kind of going left to right. The red area and the darker the red, the more of this phenomenon is going to occur that's called liquefaction. And there's probably many people on the call tonight or the Zoom tonight that are aware of this phenomenon and are probably much more well versed in it than I am. But essentially, the water table pushes up through the soils, and the soils begin to act more like a liquid. There's another related phenomenon that occurs, which is called lateral spread or lateral movement. So essentially, the soil will slope towards the river and pull apart. So those two phenomenons would obviously have pretty substantial impacts on all infrastructure in this area. But for our purposes, they would have substantial impacts on the tanks. So next slide, please. So the maybe the tanks are great and really strong, and they won't bend and break during a earthquake. Well, we checked, and it turns out that most of them were built a long time ago. Some of them, probably dating back to those historic photos that Micah was showing us. So this is important because we didn't know about the risks of an earthquake in this region, or at least maybe European settlers didn't know about the risk of earthquake to this region, until the 80s, really. And we didn't really get any kind of code or standard, I should say standards applicable to fuel tank construction until after 1993. And then there's a few tanks that are built or retrofitted after 2004 when some more applicable standards. But we can see that the vast majority of tanks are older. And we can see that really a lot of the stuff that's there is, diesel, gasoline, and other oil products. I should note that I'll put in the chat after I finish talking. There's a really detailed report on our website that I'll link to. So I'm kind of going high level here. So I might be skipping over some details people are interested in, but we can get to those in the Q&A. So there's based on that information, we estimate the total amount of oil that would be present during an earthquake, and how much of that would spill. We between 94 and 194 million gallons. To give you a sense of scale, Deepwater Horizon was 134 to 206 million gallons. So this is essentially a Deepwater Horizon scale event occurring in the middle of a major metropolitan area, and not over the course of weeks, but really over the course of minutes. Also, while there's a natural disaster of unprecedented magnitude playing out across really the entire region. So we know a lot of the stuff is flammable. Some of it's going to sink to the bottom of the river if it's heavier, and some of it's going to float on the top of the river. And that will impact how far those materials travel on the river. Next slide, please. It's also very likely that some of this stuff is going to spark, or there's going to be sparks, and that some of this stuff is going to catch fire. That's certainly been observed in other tank farms that have been subject to seismosity. So some of these tanks have like floating tops, for example, to keep down vapors. As the tank evacuates, those connections, metal on metal connections can scrape against each other and cause sparks. That's an example. That's one example of how something could spark. Power lines. There's really lots of potential ways that this could spark and explode and catch fire. But we anticipate some of it will be on the ground, and the report goes into more detail about it. And then some of these tanks are so close to the water's edge that some of the stuff will also go into the water. Next slide, please. So I don't want to sort of belabor the gloom and doom too much. So I'll just kind of cruise through a few of the high level findings. There's a lot of tanks at this facility. Not all of them are in use. Not all of them are filled. But there's also at some degree of opacity in terms of like what tanks are being used for what. But we know that all these tanks are subject to failure during a large seismic event. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mentioned the tanks. There's 630 tanks. We don't think all of them are in use. So, you know, this is important to sort of be aware of. There's also, and the kind of maximum capacity of these are 350 million gallons. But as I said, we don't think that all those tanks will be full all at once. So that's why we come at that, you know, 93 to 193 million gallons figure. Next slide, please. It's important to note that people live close to this facility. There's also people who work in this area. So, you know, depending on the time of day or you know, luck, there's going to be you know, almost certainly people who lose their lives. There's obviously going to be a lot of property damage, both right here in Portland, and damage to wildlife and ecosystems. So we estimated the total cost would be in the billions. Next slide, please. Yep, there you go. So cost may exceed $2 billion. And the loss of life, right? So this is an incredibly serious situation. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my last slide. So I wanted to end on a couple of cool developments, good developments. Thanks to the incredible organizing power of some of the people on this call and the leadership of folks in the Portland delegation. The Oregon legislature passed HB 1567 that requires all these facilities to develop seismic resilience strategies. I think there's a little bit of ambiguity in the law. So we're going to have a rules advisory process that's going to start this month. So I think it's going to be really important for those of us interested in this topic to bird dog that process. And then I'm hoping that in the new year, we'll be able to take up the issue of risk bonds and pursue that as an avenue to push on these facilities to take seismic retrofitting and or decommissioning entirely as serious options, because otherwise they're going to have to maintain insurance policies that are consistent with the level of risk that they pose to our community. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, it's pretty frightening to think about what could happen in the case of an earthquake. All that land starting to turn into like cake batter consistency and jiggle everything around, and a spill of that level would just be totally catastrophic to the lower Columbia and the estuary as well. So lots of things to fight for, to protect. And on that list is public health. So next we're going to hear from Melanie Plout, who's going to talk to us some more about public health and safety. And I'm going to put some acronyms in the chat for folks that may come up. And I'm going to pass to you, Melanie. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kate. And thanks so much, John. That was fabulous. So this is a huge topic, health and safety. And I'm going to start with a disclaimer. First of all, I'm an OBGYN doctor. I'm not an environmental health specialist. Second of all, this is going to be a super high level overview. We only, have a few minutes. And I know that a lot of people on the panel and those in the audience probably know more than I do about some of these topics. So next slide. As has been mentioned, 90% of the liquid fuel used in the state and 100% of the aviation fuel is stored here at the CIIHO, but there are at least 150 different liquids stored here. So it's a huge chemical cocktail, toxic cocktail. Next slide. So this is a primer, and maybe see if my headings go if you click the next slide here. I put in an animation, it may or may not work. Yeah, just go ahead and click them all. So many of you, oh, go back one. Many of you are probably familiar with 1267. That's the placard that a train carrying crude oil will carry. And you've probably seen the gasoline trucks that carry 1203. 1202 is for any kind of diesel. So that's for fossil diesel or renewable diesel or biodiesel. And then one bonus, there's asphalt, which has been mentioned, is moved by McCall across the street from Zenith, and that's 3257. So if you see a train that has that number on it, that's what that train is carrying. Next slide. So when I was thinking about how the structure of health problems at the CEI hub looks to me, I think there's really three sort of quote opportunities where one could be exposed to hazardous substances. So first, the routine operation of the hub, we have a lot of exposure. Second of all, accidental releases. And then third, in the use of the fuels. So during routine operation, there's vaporization anytime you transfer from one mode of transportation to another. And then there's the fossil fuel use of those modes of transportation, like the trucks and the trains. So there's quite a bit of stuff that comes off. And then, of course, the accidental releases that John has talked about. But thirdly, and I really didn't think about this originally, but there's the exposure that we get from the air pollution when those fuels are used. Next slide. So Portland has a lot of good things about it, but unfortunately our air quality is not one of them. We have relatively lax regulation of diesel vehicles compared to some adjoining states. So some old trucks are sold into Oregon and then used here. And then there's this overlap with other sources of pollution, like the ground and water contamination from the Superfund site, other industries, and of course, the degradation of our air quality from wildfires. Next slide. And this just gives you a little sense of the magnitude of the problem. The OEC said, this was from a few years ago, that diesel exhaust kills 460 Oregonians and costs the state $3.5 billion every year. So just to give you a sense of, you know, where we're kind of going with all of that. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit about the different kinds of pollutants that affect our health. And I'm just going to, for simplicity's sake, divide this into two categories. One are the criteria pollutants, and those are the ones that, according to the Clean Air Act, our government has to regulate. And these are familiar names probably to most of you. And then there's the toxics. So these are other things that are regulated often in different ways or completely unregulated. So the VOCs, or the volatile organic compounds, are the things that you might smell because they're volatile, that go into the air. And then the PAHs are usually solid, as are the dioxins and the heavy metals, and those are the long-term contaminants of soil, for instance. Click one more time. And I think this is really important, that just because a facility meets regulations doesn't mean that those levels are healthy. In fact, we have lots of information, especially about the criteria pollutants, that the levels that are set, well, certainly here in this country, should be stricter. And we know that even very low levels can lead to problems. Next slide. So during routine operation, I mean, basically, if you've spent any time at the CEI hub, you know there's some bad stuff there because you smell it, you might get a headache. But the amount of monitoring that DEQ does is pretty minimal. The closest DEQ monitoring site is at the Humboldt School. So I don't have a cursor, but you can see where the University of Portland is on the east bank of the river. And that little notch there is where the Chevron dock is, where the ships come. There's pipes under the road there that Zenith transloads to. So that's the distance. Now, whether or not the Humboldt site is even measuring air quality in the CEI hub, of course, will depend on the wind direction. And if we had more information from a meteorological site, at the hub, we might be able to make more sense of the readings that we could access from the Humboldt School. Next slide, please. So this is interesting. This is something that Nick brought to my attention just a couple of days ago, and it has to do with the emissions for these criteria pollutants that Zenith has to give an annual report to DEQ. You know that Zenith came in at the very end of 2017. In 2018, they were mostly moving tar sands, and maybe that's why the VOCs were so high, because of those respiratory irritants that they have to use to dilute the tar sands. But then I think since then they've mostly been using moving Bakken oil, which is a lighter crude. And it's very curious to me why the emissions went up so much in 2021. The number of ships, you know, I track the ships that go out of the Chevron dock. The ships hasn't changed. So either they're moving more fuel per ship, or they're doing something different. This raised more questions for me than answers, and I'm certainly interested in what other people think. Next slide. So the health risks that come from the routine emissions affect every part of our body. The reproductive tract, they cause low birth weight, many types of cancers, premature death, depression, and dementia. And then remember that the trains, which carry some of the fuels into the hub, affect people outside the hub. And in fact, we know that they go through a lot of low-income neighborhoods and places where people of color live. So they're at higher risk than some of us who live in other parts of town. Let's see, next slide. So we've talked a fair bit about the seismic risks here. It's a very unusual set of combinations, unlucky factors that we have in this CEI hub site, with having the risk for the seismic events close to a river, the urban core, the park, which can burn, and then the storage tanks being built so many years ago before the risks were understood. The number of people who would be affected by a serious accident in the hub could be as small as 200. That's about how many people actually work in the CEI hub, or could be larger, the 30,000 people who live and work in sort of the surrounding neighborhoods. And then of course, for all of us who get our gas, if we still have gas cars, it's going to be a little bit of a problem with transportation. Next slide. I want to show this picture. John mentioned the floating lids on the tanks. This is what one of those floating lids looks like. It prevents so much evaporation from occurring, but you can easily see how a metal on metal contact between the lid and the interior surface of the tank could cause a spark. Next slide. And speaking of accidents, this is kind of interesting, but an explosion in 1911 may have led to the siting of the CEI hub where it is today, because it killed the fire chief, that's David Campbell. And shortly thereafter, the city decided it really wasn't safe to have fuel storage in the city. And so they moved it, well, was a little further out into Linton. But of course, what we know now is this is the last place where you should put that much explosive liquid. Next slide. And as long as we're talking about explosions, this is one of my little pet projects. The red circle, oh, maybe you can't see it on this slide. Can you click again? No, I can look, nope, go back. So down at the bottom, there's a blue tank. There's a blue, kind of a pale blue there. And that is the LNG tank that belongs to Northwest Natural. This is where they supercool the methane gas so it becomes a liquid and then stored under pressure, and is possibly one of the biggest explosion risks in the hub. The fellow who DEQ has named to oversee the seismic analysis required by Senate Bill 1567, his name is Mike Kortenhoff, and he says this is the single facility in the hub that scares him the most. Now, we've learned a lot about this facility from Northwest Natural because they want to get some money from ratepayers to upgrade what's called the cold box. The cold box is 54 years old, and they estimate it's going to cost $10 to $15 million to upgrade it. Next slide. So the LNG that's stored in this facility is only used for winter peak during that heating season, and it only supplies 13% of Northwest Natural customers. Can you hit the next slide? And that's this yellow area that you can see here. So one of my dreams is that if we could selectively electrify the homes in this yellow area, you can see it's a little bit of Northwest, some North and some Northeast Portland, that maybe we wouldn't need this really dangerous LNG storage in the hub anymore. And after Zenith, maybe this is going to be our next big target to get out. Okay, then lastly, when we burn the fuel, it creates substances which cause global warming and pollute our air. And thousands of people in the US die from air pollution, more than from traffic accidents. And we have a pretty bad death rate from traffic accidents. Next slide. So these are some of the health effects: childhood asthma, lung and breast cancer, pregnancy problems. Next slide, click again, please. And then air pollution has been associated with a lot of effects on our central nervous system, and increases in Alzheimer's, in teenage depression, and in a paper out of the University of Chicago, bad calls by umpires. That's pretty serious. Next slide. And then particulate matter. These are the silent killers that are so small, when we breathe them in, they can even get into our bloodstream, and they are nasty. Next slide. But on a hopeful note, if we improve the air quality, we can reduce some of these risks. So this was a study from Harvard earlier this year that looked at women who were originally enrolled in a study about hormone replacement. And what they found is that in metropolitan areas, which had decreased their NO2 and particulate matter over a decade or so, they also lowered the risk of dementia. So cleaning up our act really can work. Next slide. Oh, I just threw this in because I thought people might have questions about renewable diesels. So this is my first stab at trying to find some of those answers. So for routine operation, the pollution from the trains and the other transportation is likely to be identical. I don't really have any information about the vaporization. Accidents with renewable diesel, it is flammable. It's possible that there's less soil and water damage from a spill because there are fewer of those contaminants that we have in fossil fuels, but it's not really been well studied. There would still be oiling of birds and stuff like that. And then in the use of the product, the air pollution is really highly dependent on the engine type. There does seem to be some decrease in particulate matter, maybe by about 30%. But interestingly enough, when you use biodiesel, if you mix the biodiesel in with the renewable diesel, you might actually get some increases in your NOx. If you want to dig into this a little more deeply, the City of Portland commissioned a study that is available on their website from a group called ERG. Next slide. So the fact is, when Stephen Pine coined this term, the pyrocene. And I like this term. It's the age when people have affected the climate by burning things. And the fact is, we need to keep burning stuff, not only because it affects the climate, but it also harms our health. Air pollution and climate change are really closely linked, and they have the same solution, which is to stop burning fossil fuels. They both affect frontline communities the most. And it is true that you can talk to different groups of people based on one factor than the other, and they might respond differently. Next slide. So getting off fossil fuels is not a sacrifice. And by dismantling the CI hub over the coming years, we will improve our health and reduce our risk of a disastrous event. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Melanie. Lots of information packed in here. We've heard a lot about the history, we've heard about the risks, and we've heard about the public health effects. A lot of you are probably wondering, what can we do about it? So next we're going to hear from Nick Caleb, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of the legal updates, specifics on Zenith, and kind of things like that. So I'll pass to Nick. Thanks, Nick. The real Nick Caleb, I mean.
Yeah, well, see if I can hold that reputation. Yeah, sorry about the multiple Nick Calebs. That most certainly something that I did in setting up the logistics for this event. Yeah, so I'm a climate energy attorney at Breach Collective. We're a small nonprofit based in Oregon that does support of frontline communities and climate campaigns. And I've been involved with Zenith related activities since 2019. And what I'm going to talk about is kind of so I'm going to start by talking about what could have happened, like a best case scenario in the legal and regulatory world, and something that advocates were very effectively pushing for. And then I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about what actually happened and sort of where we find ourselves and what we might be able to do about it. So in 2019, groups of activists and residents and community members started sort of figuring out that there was a lot of activity happening at the site. The site had transferred ownership recently. It used to be an asphalt facility, and suddenly it was moving crude oil by rail, being unloaded and then being put on ships and sent out of the city. Nobody voted for that. They didn't get a permit for that, right? There was no specific authorization to create a new fossil fuel terminal in Portland. In fact, one would expect quite the opposite reception from Portland's residents if you would ask them, because we'd been running really effective anti-fossil fuel infrastructure campaigns for about 5 years at that point, and passing laws and resolutions at both city and county governments. So no secret that the city of Portland's residents were hostile to new fossil fuel infrastructure. And yet this company found a way to sort of move and maneuver around existing laws to build this infrastructure while basically no one was looking. So I kind of like do the naughty thing and ask permission later kind of strategy from our fossil fuel industry friends. So that didn't sit too well with a lot of residents, and people began to organize. There was a very large meeting at the University of Portland where a bunch of city council members and the mayor promised that they were going to do something about Zenith, that they cared about this, they're going to take it very seriously. Right around that same time, myself and other attorneys who were looking at this started looking deep into air permit rules and regulations, primarily because it's very hard to stop a facility that's already in operation from doing what it's doing. It's one of the hardest things to do in environmental law. Forgive the gendered term, but a lot of these facilities are called grandfathered in once they exist, and sort of new rules don't apply as strong to existing facilities as they do to new facilities. So by virtue of becoming this existing facility, they got certain rights and privileges associated with the facility. And advocates had to figure out really creative ways in order to leverage community pressure and the law and our political system against that kind of activity. So we started digging into the problem, started digging into laws at the state level, especially around air permits, because we knew that Zenith would have to reapply for an air permit in the near future. And we started learning about this thing called a land use compatibility statement, which I'll refer to as LUX for short during this presentation. A LUX is sometimes just a little box at the end of an air permit application. A company will have to ask a municipal government for permission, basically as a part of their air permit renewal process or application process. And if a city says yes, that's a signal that the land use rules of the city allow such a use. A city can also say no. It hadn't happened very often in Oregon history that we could find, but it wasn't wholly unprecedented. But city officials didn't really know about this tool in the law. The Department of Environmental Quality didn't even really know about this tool in the law, and yet it was written in statute and our administrative rules, so it was the law. So myself and others began to try to convince city officials and the DEQ that it was a thing that they needed to take seriously. Eventually, perhaps because of frustration at the Department of Environmental Quality from being misled repeatedly by Zenith over the years in a variety of contexts, they actually agreed with us and told the city of Portland that Zenith would have to get a new land use compatibility statement in order to get a renewed air permit, because the facility had intensified its uses in the time since it last received a Lux. As I mentioned, it turned from an asphalt facility to an crude oil facility. There's way more activity going on. They constructed things. And again, nobody ever had an opportunity to say yes or no. So the pandemic hit, and not a lot of activism in the climate world is happening for a year and a half or so. And so this issue was still ongoing, but it wasn't being sort of like openly considered. Other priorities were coming. And then last summer, suddenly we found out that Zenith's air permit was going to come up for reconsideration. The Department of Environmental Quality basically told them they had to go get this Lux from the city and put a timer on it into the fall. They had to get it by the fall. Advocates started mobilizing and putting pressure on the city council at City of Portland, specifically Commissioner Dan Ryan, because he was in charge of the agency called the Bureau of Development Services that was responsible for issuing the Lux, and basically saying, don't do this, Dan. This is a bad facility. It's not aligned with our laws. We need you to deny this Lux. Enormous pressure campaign ensued. I personally believe that the city was inclined to grant the Lux up until just a few days before the decision point, but the organizing was so intense and so effective and involved so many members of the political class, including all 5 of the Multnomah County commissioners, and I think like 20 or 21 Oregon state legislators, Democrats, who basically said, City of Portland, you need to deny this Lux. And because they hadn't adequately prepared, they didn't have a great supporting group of evidence for when they made the denial of the Lux. They basically wrote a couple of pages and said, yeah, it violates our comprehensive plan, but not in a, from a legal perspective, not in an oppressive manner. It was not performed that well. A side note, we encouraged them back in 2019 to make significant findings around that so that we wouldn't have this very same problem, but they didn't listen. So anyway, they denied the Lux. Zenith sued, and their argument was that the city doesn't have this power at all. The city can't say no to a Lux. It's just not a thing. Zenith ended up losing at the Land Use Board of Appeals. That judicial body said that the city does in fact have the power to deny the Lux, but you've got to do a better job with your findings. You've got to actually tell us how in your comprehensive plan this isn't allowed. My opinion is that there's adequate evidence in our comprehensive plan to make that argument. And because we were winning in court and we won at the Oregon Court of Appeals, and just last week we learned that we won at the Oregon Supreme Court, that the city would have been in a position to go back and deny this Lux again with greater evidence. And in my personal opinion, and maybe this is shared by others, I'm not sure in the legal field, but my opinion is that we would have won that lawsuit, or stood a very good chance of winning that lawsuit. If we had won, if we'd have denied this Lux a second time and had won, Zenith would not have an air permit. And if they wanted to keep operating, they would have to apply for a new air permit. And in the interim time, they could be enjoined from operating by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So that's a universe that could have happened. Instead, what happened is that 2 weeks, or maybe about three weeks or 3.5 weeks ago, Zenith did this big PR push all at once and started running ads on MSNBC and running these like really nice sounding videos about how much they respected the city of Portland, how much they love the climate action plan, and how much they want to be a climate leader in Portland. Simultaneously, they submitted a second land use compatibility statement while the first one was being litigated that made 4 promises. Basically, they said, we're going to phase out our crude oil operations over 5 years. We're going to get rid of some of the storage tanks. It's not clear which ones, but 30 of them. They're going to reduce the amount of volatile organic compounds that are coming out of the facility. And as Melanie showed you, they had increased pretty dramatically. So they said, we'll reduce that by 80%, which would have been still high for the past levels. So it actually is not that impressive when you run the numbers. I don't know if the city actually did that or not. And then they said they were going to decommission the asphalt refinery. The city took 2 weeks and agreed to this without any public input, no fanfare at all. I think a lot of us in the coalition spaces that work on this, were kind of thinking about how we approach the city and talk about this, and just like rapidly move this decision out the door. The press from the city was claiming climate victory because, you know, in the city's opinion, renewable fuels are this amazing climate solution, right? That because there's arguably less carbon that's reduced per gallon of fuel than in crude oil, which I say arguably because I'm not sure that many folks on this call agree with that. In fact, we sent many folks here, part of a coalition that sent comments to the city in one of their rulemaking processes around biofuels, saying that we're not sure that we actually believe the claims around biofuels. And they certainly don't make the river safer. They don't make train traffic safer. Renewable diesel also explodes, also spills, also is a danger to the community in similar ways to crude. So where we're at now is that this basically Zenith has created this, they've sort of like invented a world where the Lux is a contract to be negotiated. I'm not sure that that's how that works. But the city has accepted that premise that they can sort of like negotiate around this land use grant. If nobody does anything to interrupt that legally, and I'm not fully sure if there is a way. I mean, it strikes me as strange that you could have 2 active Lux applications at the same time. That seems weird, and something that maybe the DEQ should look into whether that's legal or not. But if there's nothing that folks find to interrupt that, it's likely that just sort of like as practice, if Zenith applies for a what's called an air contaminant discharge permit, as they've sort of promised the city that they will by March, if they do that, then perhaps this grant of a Lux will stand, and the city will have kind of offered its leverage away for, you know, promises of carbon reduction and all the rest. I don't think it's a great deal personally. I think the city had significant leverage and could have got a much better deal out of this. Functionally speaking, we're talking about dangerous crude oil trains running through our communities for another 5 years, and then dangerous renewable diesel trains running through our community for an indefinite future. So on the safety and the seismic standpoint, we haven't gained much. Whether there's a climate benefit or not, I'm not sure yet. I'm still trying to learn about that. So, you know, I'll start to transition a little bit here. I don't have a satisfying answer right now about, is there a legal pathway? It's something that I'm looking into. I know a lot of our partners are. You know, for folks who follow this really closely, I know many of the folks on this call are deeply invested in this issue, as we are. You will probably learn really quickly if we come up with something like that. But for the time being, it's in a research phase. I have suspicions around some areas where we might have power, but I'm not willing to sort of like put those out in public at this moment, because I haven't vetted them properly yet. So stay tuned to that. But as was mentioned by some of the speakers, there are other things that the public can get involved in. As I mentioned, there's a renewable fuels standard update that's moving through the city right now. And because it's so relevant to Zenith, this is an area where residents can make they can voice their concerns about Zenith. You can tell the city that there's not adequate guardrails in the current policy, because it's not clear to me that Zenith won't just say they're building renewable facilities and then use those for fossil fuels. I don't see any reason why they can't do that right now, is with the way the code is written. And that's how they came to exist in the first place, right? Using an asphalt terminal and turning it into a fossil fuel facility. So you can comment there. As John Washtinsky mentioned, the county is committed to investigating financial assurance mechanisms for these fossil fuel facilities, to have adequate, basically like financial assurances and insurance, or whatever code ends up being. That's a promise the county has made to us. And so we have every right to go to the county en masse and ask for a policy there. And I think we should. There are these DEQ processes that are ongoing as well around seismic resiliency. But more than anything, why we have been successful in these fossil fuel fights in the past has less to do with the law and finding a silver bullet and far more to do with organizing for power in numbers. And so that's the thing that we absolutely have to continue to do, is continue to make our coalition strong, add new areas of the coalition. For example, labor, especially workers in the CI hub, that's been a elusive, it's been hard to partner because they have sort of joined in opposition to us, but there's a lot of movement to be made there. And there are just a lot of members of our community that could join us in this fight. And we're very powerful when we organize in numbers. So I'm certainly not in a space where I'm ready to concede this fight. And I don't think anybody else on this call is. So, stay motivated, stay true. We've had Zenith on the ropes for a while, and we very well might again soon. So I'll leave it there. And, I'm always available if folks want to reach out and ask me further questions about this stuff.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, this is there, as you mentioned, there's just so many unanswered questions still that we feel that the city should be answering to the public about this decision. So I know, as you mentioned, lots of partners are looking into the different avenues, and so many of these things are connected, right? And Melanie's talking about emissions and these combined emissions, the cumulative effects of these emissions. And then we look at a company like Zenith, where they're declaring that they're going to cut their emissions by up to 80%. And they provide these numbers, which are essentially just often based on algorithms, right? We saw this in other places like Cardi, where they have a manufacturer that provides an algorithm to calculate emissions. They came back later and said, whoops, that was wrong. It's actually much higher emissions, and then they looked for a permit modification. So it's really important that we have verifiable numbers and that we have something that's enforceable. It's unclear how enforceable this new Lux is. So yeah, thank you, Nick, for that. I think it's important to remember that the decisions that we make here in Portland have huge effects upstream and downstream. So next, we're going to be hearing from Lori King, who's going to talk to us more about community engagement, how folks can get involved, different opportunities that are happening, and just kind of what's happened with this campaign over there. So I'll pass to you, Lori.
Thanks. Thank you to all the speakers. It's really important to hear all of this. And besides working with Climate Jobs and Jobs with Justice, I'm a member of one of Zenith's most affected communities. I live in St. John's, 4 miles north of Zenith. We can see the tanks in the CEI hub across the river from our house. And I'm very thankful for the scientific information and the doctor's testimony and attorneys. And it's critical that we get this out. But I want to say that I do have an excellent sense of smell. I know the smell of the combination of crude and cancer-causing solvents. I smell it when I drive down St. Helens Road near Zenith and the other tanks. I smell that odor in less concentrated form too often right outside my house. And I do believe that I can predict when crude oil is being transferred from rail cars to tanks and from the tanks to the ships. To add these toxics to neighborhoods that already suffer the most from air pollution in a city that has some of the most polluted air in the country is wrong. And we know that, of course, that race and class issues are at play. A Multnomah County analysis found that 1 in 4 county residents live within a half mile of an oil rail line that's generally thought to be the danger zone in the event of fire from derailment. Large portions of the residents are people of color. And I'm really happy tonight that the St. John's, Cathedral Park, Portsmouth, and Linton neighborhood associations have co-sponsored this series of forums. And I really hope that some of my neighbors are hearing the presentations tonight. I want everyone in all the neighborhoods, especially affected by Zenith, to know how serious the risks associated with Zenith and the CEI hub are. And I want everyone in Portland to have access to information about the incredibly small window we have in which to stop the use of fossil fuels and how Zenith poses serious threats to our climate. Like, I'm thankful, very thankful that Multnomah County and the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management commissioned a report that John talked about on likely damages that would be caused by the CEI hub in the event of an earthquake. And there are individuals in local government like John who spread the word on this report. And I know that he was on KBOO, and that's great and incredible. But still, and this is critical, not enough community people know about the risks and about how serious they are. There's a lot of us who know about it, but it's got to be much broader and deeper. And the more people who know about it, the more the possibilities for future action get enhanced. So the more people know about it, the more serious the actions that we take can be. So sometimes community members are very well informed about risks. When the city did road construction near our house on North Baltimore this summer, we got a thoughtful notice from them in our mailbox saying to expect noise and dust and asphalt fumes. In the case of COVID, local and state officials systematically warned us about risks and took measures to protect us. But it's laughable to think that of the city placing notices in our mailboxes warning of the problems with Zenith and the CEI hub in that it's built on a liquefaction zone and the danger that this would be in an earthquake, or that a warning that there might be some extra crude oil pollution on such and such an afternoon, and you better keep your window shut and stay inside. Of course, the city and the DEQ do not systematically inform communities of these risks, quite the opposite. And this is where the community organizations that put on this forum come into the picture. For years, like Nick was saying, people from these organizations have involved many people, including me, in a campaign to educate and take action on Zenith and the CEI hub. And I want to show you some of what's been done so far. So, grassroots versus Zenith, the struggle continues. Next, please. Next, yeah. Education was the basis of action, and it still is today here at this webinar. So this is a pre-COVID forum at Temple Havara Shalom, and it's the panel. Next. And here's a really large and very interesting forum at City Hall, and it's where I got interested and heard some similar information to what's being presented tonight, and it was so important to me. Next. And here are people delivering cards to City Hall. One of them reads, "No more trains 500 feet from my house. Fossil fuels wreck our future." Lots of these cards were submitted, and they say, "Zenith, you missed the memo." In addition, there were streams of letters, and this is in 2019, there were streams of letters, expert testimony to City Council, plus a monster petition in 2019 calling on the city to stop Zenith operations and expansion. And that petition had over 7,000 signatures. Next. Civil disobedience, a garden planted on Zenith's rail tracks. This action asks us to imagine how the land looked to Indigenous people before white colonization, and to think about what the land still might become. This action led to arrests. In the trial, the necessity defense was allowed, and the jury was 5-1 in favor of our heroes. Next, please. Yeah, and here they are sitting on the tracks singing. Next. And many people came down to help them with food and different things that they needed while they were sitting on the tracks. Next. Sunrise went to the Mayor Wheeler's office demanding that he stop Zenith's expansion while there was a large rally outside. There were other rallies also, like the one in Cully neighborhood on the anniversary of the train derailment in Mosier. Next. Mother's Day 2021. A lot of cards were delivered to City Council members on behalf of children and Mother Earth. Also, a parade delivered another monster number of petition signatures to City Hall. Soon after this, the city denied the land use compatibility statement that Zenith needed for an air quality permit. Next. And we'll end with a, whoops, a little bit fuzzy. We'll end with photos from a 60-hour vigil at Zenith that was done to educate the public and also keep track of trains containing tar sands oil. And we were looking at those different red markings on the train to see which ones were carrying tar sands oil. And you, of course, see the train in the background. Next. Yeah, and next. Next. Always music really helps. And the struggle continues by and for young people. It has been organized grassroots effort that got the city and the DEQ to deny Zenith permits in 2021 and might well have influenced the Oregon Supreme Court to agree with the city. We will keep struggling to influence the DEQ to deny an air quality permit to Zenith now, and also to get the city to rescind the egregiously undemocratic reversal by Dan Ryan and the BDS, and to transform the CEI hub to transition off fossil fuels. We clearly need to build more power to do this. I mean, like I was saying before, the more people, community people, and people organized broadly and deeply, the more people who are knowledgeable and see the importance of fighting Zenith and see the incredible risks that it poses, the more the possibilities occur for action that can keep pressuring our city government and the DEQ. So some super important things to do now, right now, is to contact the DEQ's new interim director, Leah Felden. And after welcoming her to her new post, ask that the DEQ deny an air quality permit to Zenith. And the good news is that the DEQ said that they will be looking for robust public input. So it's really a great thing to make that call. Also, ask the mayor and Dan Ryan to rescind that recent land use compatibility statement, and any outrage that you feel is in place. Next. Thanks. Very important. It's really a great thing to do to get information out to the public with leaflets and doing flash mobs, and people are organizing to do flash mobs. I mean, does that sound like fun or what? We'll also be going to neighborhood associations. It's incredibly important to bring this information to the broader public. As I mentioned before, the city and the DEQ get poor grades in this. They don't protect. Let's see. Yes. Also a very good thing to do is to bring your friends to some of the next forums. Like, you can organize a group of your friends to go to the next forums, and Kate will be talking about that. The next one will be in person. So it'd be great to bring people, and that's a way that everyone here can help in educating and pushing the boundaries of who knows about this and who gets really concerned. There'll also be a family-friendly action at City Hall, and as well as planning for nonviolent direct action. To join these efforts, really keep track of the emails and phone numbers on these slides, and you might want to get your phones out. In fact, maybe we should go back so people can get their phones out and take a picture of both of these last slides. Yeah. And finally, visit the Braided River exhibit at City Hall on Tuesday, October 25th from 2 to 5 for a new vision of the lower Willamette River, and bring friends to that. And be sure to check out the Columbia Riverkeeper website for background. So there's lots of ways to be part of organizing, and we all can take a part in some way. It's been amazing to be part of this event tonight. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. So inspiring to see all those pictures, and brought back a lot of great memories working in community with folks. And yes, I want to make sure people know that there are some upcoming community forums that we're scheduling. The next one will be November 16th at 6 p.m. We're planning on having it in person at St. Luke Lutheran Church. That's at 4595 Southwest California in Portland. 97219. That's near the Southwest Community Center. So it'd be great. And then COVID permitting, we're gonna hopefully schedule the additional following forums in person. That will be December 8th and January 17th, but the time and location is TBD depending on COVID. So make sure you stay tuned for updates on that. And all of the take action pieces, as I mentioned earlier, everybody's going to get a recording of the webinar. And I know there's some questions. And before we jump in to questions, I just wanted to take a moment to encourage everyone to really remember where this all started. In the beginning, when we heard about Zenith, community members really rose up and just refused to be bullied into the threats of oil trains plowing through our communities. And the fact that we now have a fully functioning oil by rail facility volunteering to transition off of crude oil completely in 5 years, whether or not we feel trusting of that promise, it is a huge deal. It's a major accomplishment to have pushed the needle that far on this issue. And that's really totally the result of all of you, all of the community members and partners and supporters working together to protect what we love. We all did that. You all did that. We've come a huge, long way in this fight, and we're not ready to give up. Do we need 5 more years of oil trains? No, but a year ago that wasn't even on the table. So let's keep pushing and make sure our elected officials hear our questions, our concerns, and that we are not okay with this quick and quiet decision to gamble on oil for another 5 years. So I know we covered a ton of stuff, and we're going to try to get to a few questions. All of us, I think, are open to being contacted after this, and we will have following forums. So I know we won't get to all the questions. We'll answer what we can, and we're going to hop into that. And I also want to remind folks after, about 10 minutes of Q&A, we're going to put on a song to take us out for the evening. So stick around for that. I am going to start with a question from Howard. And I just also want to just recognize that some of the answers may be unsatisfactory just because there's so many unanswered questions about some of this stuff. But Howard has a question about Oregon land use laws and the requirements for public input. I know that might be different between the city and the state, but Howard's wondering, is the city in violation of ORS land use laws by not sending notifications and having public input on their meeting, deciding to approve the Zenith Lux? So I'm gonna start with maybe Nick to see if you have any thoughts on that.
The city would argue that it's basically an administrative decision and they don't have to have public process on that. They could have public process. I just don't think they're required to. So yeah, I mean, I think we should ask for it, and we should ask for fora, and we should ask for explanation. One thing I didn't mention, and I meant to at the end of my talk, was that until the DEQ grants an air permit to Zenith, the city can rescind its grant of a Lux at any time. And so I think asking for process, absolutely, like have a public meeting and take input from the community is definitely a demand that should be on the table.
Thanks, Nick. Also, I see Howard is asked, following up, saying, can it be appealed to LUBA? And I know that on Riverkeeper's end, we're looking into all the different options to look at potential for a reconsideration of that decision to appeal that Lux. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know, but I know that if a petitioner appeals a denial of a Lux, it goes to LUBA. But if someone were to appeal an approval of a Lux, I'm not sure that it would still go to LUBA, or if it, like maybe Nick might know that, if it might go to a different court. But either way, we are looking into what different pathways might be available to try to get a reconsideration of that decision and allow for some public input. Yeah, let's see. So another question that I'm getting is there any suggestions about the best policy position to take in the presence of such uncertainty? And I think that's a tough question to field, but Anybody have any thoughts on policy position? John?
Yeah, I think that, when there's uncertainty, but the potential consequences of inaction are really high, or we think that there might be big, downsides to a certain thing happening. I think it makes sense to act. That's what we sometimes refer to as a precautionary principle. Is if something is big and bad and irreversible can happen, then we should try to prevent it from happening, even if it seems like the likelihood is low, or if the likelihood is uncertain, or the consequences are maybe a little bit uncertain. But I think one thing is certain with this facility is when the big one rips, it's going to be bad. It's just kind of degrees of bad, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Nick, and then Lori, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, speaking, I guess, as a lawyer, I don't think we should limit our demands to what's sort of 1 foot in front of us legally viable in this given moment. I think we should have the audacity to dream of and demand a future without the Northwest Industrial Zone being a sacrifice zone. Like, I think we can and should organize to that. And if the city won't entertain us by creating its own plans, then we can plan as a community and do that ourselves and use art and song and food and community in order to build that vision and build enough power that it can't be ignored eventually. That's something that's well within our grasp. I think luckily we don't have to do it alone, because I think we do have allies in government like John and others who pay close attention. But I just don't think we should take no for an answer from people who are protecting the fossil fuel industry. It's just not the way that I see things. I see the fossil fuel industry as a huge threat to the history or to the future of existence on this planet. And if you all agree with me, and if you agree that it's a huge existential threat to our community, then we just don't take no for an answer. That's basically how you approach that. And then we figure out the answers along the way.
Thanks, Nick. Lori?
I think I'm saying something similar. I would say organize, educate, do all the things that will increase our power, which means getting to new people, telling them, about the forums, asking people to make those calls. The more people who call Dan Ryan and Mayor Wheeler and say rescind the recent Lux, the more people get invested in the struggle, and we just have to keep building, and the possibilities change about what we can get done the more people who are involved. So I just want to say organize and educate.
And I second that. Thank you. I'm going to try to fit in one more question before we play that song on our way out. Thanks everybody for your patience and sticking with us. We have a question from that says, what do you say when somebody says, yay, biofuels, as has happened to Barbara Ford lately? Can we have a succinct explanation of why they still suck? And I saw that Melanie took a crack at that answer. Melanie, you want to share with the group what your answer was?
Yeah, so, I didn't mention this when I was talking about the renewable fuels, but there's a lot of uncertainty about the climate advantage. And it has to do partially with the fact that you have to have a crop of some kind that you're using to make the biofuel. It could be a crop or a waste product. And there is carbon intensity involved with that. And then the way they define how much it is better for the climate than diesel fuel is really based on modeling, and it gets very complicated very quickly. But the fact is, it's not based on measurements, it's based on modeling. And some of the modeling is pretty iffy and affected by the industry. So as part of the precautionary principle in terms of the climate, it's not good. And then second of all, I would say this creates an industry, a whole industry of biofuels to fight against electrification. That's the last thing we need, is to have this new industry that's going to say, no, we shouldn't electrify heavy duty trucks or whatever it is. They're going to want to keep a hold on this biofuel industry. And then the third thing is, it shouldn't be in the hub. It shouldn't be in any kind of sensitive zone, because as I mentioned, there are still concerns with flammability and spills, and that stuff doesn't change. The fossil fuels used to process it and to transport it, that doesn't change. Not so good, just not so good. We need to go electric as fast as possible. But I'm open to other people's, maybe Nick has a word to say about that too.
Yeah, I would just say be suspicious and critically minded when you see things that are offered by the fossil fuel industry as these big, like, great plans. Generally they're not. The reason why they end up working in this situation, I think, is that it was an easy out for the city to kind of get this thing off their plate and claim a victory and not fight it any longer, because maybe they never had the will to do it, or because maybe Dan Ryan's not facing an election now, so he feels the pressure's off. Whatever their internal calculus is, they were offered basically like a branding win by the fossil fuel industry, and they just leapt at it. But we shouldn't be so happy to leap at these things. Basically, the whole entire fossil fuel industry is offering different forms of quote unquote renewable fuels because they know that people don't like them. And so people associate major climate damages with them. And so they've got to come up with something, right? But like Melanie said, I generally assume that this is first and foremost about extending the life of the fossil fuel industry with some token kind of like programs and pilots and things like that. And it's not just the crude oil terminals. You see the same thing with Northwest Natural and their proposed hydrogen blending experiments on the residents of West Eugene and things like that. But be skeptical and basically don't concede that ground to the fossil fuel industry without adequate evidence.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think that that's a good advice. I think that we can't expect that suddenly this industry has their goals aligned with us. And we need to keep really looking at all the unknowns, what types of feedstock, land use implications, all of these different things as well. So I know we're short on time. As we're wrapping up, I just want to say, I hope you're all feeling really inspired and motivated to keep fighting to reduce the potential harm at the CEI Hub and Zenith. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking your time and energy to join this conversation. It's been really a very productive, valuable conversation, super helpful for me to have all of you in the same space talking about this. Thank you to Josie Reach for running our tech tonight, to the planning team. Thank you for putting together this series of community forums, and thank you all to the participants for joining us today. We're going to exit with a little bit of music. That's a sneak peek into the some of the music for the flash mob. So thank you all. I hope you have a great night, and stick around for the music.
Dirty in the streets, gonna clean up your mess someday. Polluting the space, a big disgrace. Spewing your toxins all over the place. Singing, we will stop you. We will stop you. Zenith, you are done for, over. Stop you in your tracks and we'll send you a bill to pay. You will be replaced without a trace. We're about to kick you out of this place. We will stop you. We will stop you. Zenith, you are old news, bold fools, grabbing all you can and in touch with the world today. It's time to embrace a safe, clean space. Until you are gone, we'll be on your case. We will stop you. Everybody, we will stop you. Louder! We will stop you. One more time. We will stop you. roads in the coming earthquake. I hear the lion lies, all barons like to drop their tactical delays. We're gonna make them stop. We're here for justice, keep Portland growing free. Gonna keep on working to make it carbon free.
Well, the corporate strategy plans to export the cost of all the water that's poisoned in neighborhoods that will be lost. You know those companies tell us don't worry about what's fair. They think that profit is much more important than water and air.
So we know that Chapin's gotta go, no stealings. Chapin's gotta go, no killings. Chapin's gotta go, no burnings. Oh, Chapin's gotta go.
Now we're building some community. That movement is our opportunity to grow our wisdom and our unity. But in the meantime, we are doing everything to make our city carbon free. And the corporate strategy plans to export the cost of all the water that's poisoned in neighborhoods that will be lost. You know those companies tell us don't worry about what's fair. They think that profit is much more important than water and air.
So we know that Chapin's gotta go, no stealings. Chapin's gotta go, no killings. Chapin's gotta go, no burnings. Oh, Chapin's gotta go. Yeah, we know that Chapin's gotta go, no stealings. Chapin's gotta go, no killings. Chapin's gotta go, no burnings. Oh, Chapin's gotta go.
All right, folks. Thank you. Have a good night.